lifelong, even beyond lifelong commitment if you want to keep these things going technologically. So I've thought of another strategy, because I've only known her for 11 months, I think.
Yeah.
And for the last 11 months, we've been working on something called cold calling. And what this is it's so new, we're not even quite done.
Can you pass out the
There's a little URL there don't play it now because you get distracted and you won't participate. But it's an audio only collaborative work between Dina and myself, and it's a prequel to Disappearing Rain. That's why I called this little part of the talk Reappearing Rain. Of course, Disappearing Rain is almost 20 years old. This one is encased in and accessed through a rotary phone that's been subtly filled with new computer hardware, a Raspberry Pi. These features establish it as a kind of a neither nor hybrid, an unsolicited audio reanimation of memory and a reconnection with something new, but a simulation of the past that evokes presence. So it's kind of a forward glance over traveled roads in a sense, because it offers a branching and interactive story of networks, intersections, regret and power and determination. And in form and content, it interrogates ways in which stories are accessed, preserved, and extended through objects, because the user seriously has to dial numbers and put this phone up to their ear and listen and actually speak and contribute stories to the story, so it's ever evolving as well. And cold calling's connection to Disappearing Rain is, this, you might think, well, this isn't really reanimation, but it is in a way. Cold calling's connection plot-wise to Disappearing Rain is a creative way of revitalizing and extending the older electronic work beyond preservation and archiving practices. So I'm actually not concerned with archiving Disappearing Rain. If it has 404 links, that's fine. If it actually eventually disappears, it will not ever, I'm sure. But if it does disappear, that's okay, because there's still these references to it. And sometimes, we were talking the other day, is when loved ones pass on, we can still reference them. It doesn't bring them back in their fleshy instantiation, but those memories, I think, are important. So what it does is, this creative event and its employment of multiple manifestations and multimodal interaction and things like that, it pursues parachronistic simulation as a strategy of reanimation. And parachronism is, the best way to explain it is if you set your clock 10 minutes ahead when you set your alarm, because you want to wake up at 8:30, but you don't really want to wake up at 8:30, you want to wake up at 8:20, so your clock is always a little bit ahead. You're kind of living in a time that's not quite the present and not quite the past, but something that's almost removed from the timeline in itself. So parachronistic simulation is the wonderful multi-syllabic term I've chosen here. So how do we keep older ELIT breathing? So not just functional and accessible, but actually desirable. So a common sense answer would be, as we've talked about, that desire is enabled through accessibility. So a simple solution to extending the life of ELIT involves strategies of emulation and distribution, open access collections, permanent installations, online distributions. These are important strategies, yes, as are Dina Griegar and Stuart Malthrop's strategies of traversal, video playthroughs, larger archives of material related to particular projects. But another approach is to create newer works that narratively connect to older works, thus renewing their relevance within a vast narrative ecosystem. We need to do this more. We need to connect with each other's stories. And I think that's a way to keep ourselves kind of current and relevant. Stephen King does a great job of it, right? With his own novels, he's got that kind of main environment where, you'll be reading Cujo and it'll mention this weird car that was haunted, and of course there's Christine, right, in the background of this other novel. It's very simple, but I think it's really necessary. So more specifically though, creating prequels, engaging in intentional anachronism or anachronistic synchronicity reestablishes the older work of ELIT parachronistically. So in other words, producing a prequel for an existing work repositions that work as an imminent event. Like now that we've created cold calling, Disappearing Rain is now in the future. It's not 20 years ago. Disappearing Rain is going to happen. And that's kind of cool, right? It reconfigures the older narrative as one that hasn't happened and one that's enabled as a future by the newer offering. So this is what we've attempted to do with the relationship between Disappearing Rain and cold calling, revitalizing the currency and visibility of the former by creating the latter as a prequel, restores vitality to a nearly 20-year-old work by using 70-year-old phone hardware. The main antagonist of cold calling, as Dina has spoiled for you, is Cameron, the lover villain in Disappearing Rain, who seduces the two sisters to literally disappear into the internet. So the larger creative motivation behind the story and telephone interface of cold calling is related to this desire to reanimate old technology. So you can see kind of we've tried to reanimate the old rotary phone in the same way that they're trying to reanimate disappearing rain, in a sense, right? It's a similar desire to infuse these older things, objects, and works with purpose and life that relates to their instrumentality as delivery mechanisms for interactive stories. So in the telephone version of cold calling, and if you're really super interested, we do have an artist talk, which is the last one of the day at like 5 or something. But anyways, check it out if you don't go to one of the other 17 parallel sessions. But in its telephone version, a 70-year-old rotary phone is retrofitted with the Raspberry Pi, and both of these machines are adapted to be able to work with each other. And I think that's the coolest thing. The Pi is talking to the rotary dialer and working through the speaker and microphone of the old handset, which is really cool. Both of these machines are adapted to be able to work with each other, input via the rotary dial mechanism, and the microphone is connected to the Pi via GPIO, or general purpose input-output pins, and interpreted into functional data via Python code. We're still working on finalizing this. We've got the proof of concept is sound, and it's just a couple more months and we'll have this fully functional thing. So the rotary phone becomes a storyteller. It's an interactive instrument for delivering a participatory narrative experience to users. This mechanical synthesis of old to new is directly parallel to our creative process of reanimating older systems and stories via new circuits and expanded networks. But now there's some irony here, right? A single phone object, or in our case, ideally 4 or 5, if we'll clone them.
We've already promised 3.
Yeah, each modified to become a self-contained story machine. That's kind of not enough, right? I mean, that's really limiting access if you have this one object that maybe circulates to very limited audiences for a small amount of time. So such uniqueness restricts exposure and circulation, which works against our intentions to more broadly revitalize the earlier work. So the telephone interface, though, also will uniquely privileging auditory interaction over the primacy of visual communication, because sometimes we've got to get away from our eyes, I think, a little bit and get back to the wonderful richness of audio. But that's exclusive against those who might experience hearing difficulty or impairment. So there's an exclusivity to the phone, version of cold calling. So to this end, we've concurrently developed a Twine version of the work. You hear a lot about Twine. I'm sure I love Twine. I use it in everything. I get my students to use Twine. This adaptation, as Dina was talking with adaptation, it sacrifices some of the affordances related to the telephone interface, such as the recording of spoken narratives by users that are replayed to later users and the use of a rotary dial. I've tried to get a little JavaScript rotary dial. It's not working. But it also circumvents the aforementioned constraints of audio-only interaction. So it's kind of a closed caption version, right, on the Twine screen. Creating these concurrent versions during the development phase pluralized avenues of access, right? And it generated this multimodal potential for encountering the story. And we actually started thinking about the story differently by creating it in 2 versions at the same time, not just a couple years later trying to figure out how it would adapt to something else. But that multiple creation at the time that this thing was being formed is a pretty illuminating experience. Also, just an anecdote. At the end of it, I had the prototype on the URL there and showed it to my son last week, and I tried to make it like a black screen with the green glowy letters, like an old CRT monitor or the Pip-Boy if you play Fallout games. And I said, "Luke, what do you think of this?" And he looks and he goes, I can't read it, Dad. I can't see this." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And then, of course, he's colorblind. So I had to adjust to that kind of accessibility as well. So there's something about the accessibility, not just in terms of broad audiences and broad time frames, but also just as many users as possible with as many different abilities to try to get into this story space. That's so important, right? I'm really babbling, aren't I?
Yeah, you are. And
okay,
you're over time.
2 seconds. That's it. But there is this. I mean, I think there's those broad considerations of accessibility, both again through time, technology, and ability. So, yeah.
Yay!
Thanks.